Okay, so bleeding disorders. You've sent over some pretty in-depth stuff here, ready to dive in.
Let's do it. It's a fascinating area.
It really is. I mean, honestly, it's kind of amazing that we don't all like spring a leak every time we get a paper cut. How does our body even manage to keep all that blood inside?
Right. It's like this whole intricate dance happening inside us all the time, and we don't even realize it.
Exactly. And that's basically what this whole thing, what's it called? Hemostasis, right?
Yeah, hemostasis. Basically, your body's way of saying nope to bleeding out.
Uh-huh. Exactly. And the source material you sent breaks it down into these three main parts: vasoconstriction, platelet plug formation, and then the coagulation cascade.
And they all work together, right? Like a
Yeah.
chain reaction, one step triggering the next.
Right. So first up, vasoconstriction. That sounds kind of intense.
It's actually pretty straightforward. It just means the blood vessels near an injury, they constrict, which basically means they get smaller to help slow down the blood flow to that area.
Oh, so it's like kinking a hose
Yeah,
to reduce the flow.
exactly. A temporary clamp to buy some time. Then come the platelets, these tiny little cells in your blood that rush to the injury site.
Platelets, those are the, what, like the first responders?
Pretty much, they clump together, forming this little plug to seal the injury, like a temporary patch.
Okay, so vasoconstriction clamps it down, platelets patch it up, and then this is where it gets a bit more complex, right? The coagulation cascade. Sounds kind of ominous.
It does sound a bit dramatic, right? Like something out of a spy movie. But it's basically this series of steps, a cascade of protein activations that ultimately leads to a stable blood clot.
So kind of like a chain reaction, but on a molecular level.
Precisely. Each protein activates the next and so on until bam, you've got a clot and the bleeding stops.
Wow, that is pretty remarkable when you think about it. But from what I gathered, the material you sent focuses on what happens when this intricate system, when it doesn't quite go to plan, right?
You got it. That's where bleeding disorders come in. And the material breaks it down really well into those three main categories: vascular defects, platelet disorders, and coagulation disorders.
So problems can arise in any of those three stages, basically.
Exactly. It can be an issue with the blood vessels constricting properly, the platelets forming that initial plug, or that final cascade that forms the stable clot.
It's like if any one of those things goes wrong, the whole system can get thrown off.
Exactly. Yeah. And within each of those categories, vascular, platelet, and coagulation, you have specific conditions, each with its own unique characteristics and challenges.
Like hemophilia A, for example, there's a whole section on that. That one stood out to me, especially that bit about how 30% of cases are new mutations.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. It means there's no family history. It just happens.
It really makes you think about genetics and inheritance, like how much do we really understand?
Absolutely. And that's a whole other deep dive.
So we've got these three main categories of bleeding disorders, but the source material really seems to focus on hemophilia A. There's a lot of detail in there. What makes this one so, I don't know, important to understand?
Well, hemophilia A is a really good example of how even a tiny little hiccup in our DNA can have some big consequences.
Yeah, and it talks about this flip tip inversion in the factor VIII gene, which sounds kind of, I don't know.
A bit like a gymnastics move.
Right, like a gymnastics move.
Right.
But it's obviously way more complicated than that. So how does this flip tip thing actually cause problems?
Okay, so think of your DNA like a set of instructions, right, for building proteins.
Okay, I'm with you.
So in hemophilia A, this flip tip inversion is like you've gone and swapped a couple of words in those instructions, specifically for factor VIII, which, if you remember, is one of those key proteins in the coagulation cascade.
Right, right. So instead of getting a perfect factor VIII protein, you end up with something that's a bit,
Off.
yeah, a bit off.
Exactly. And because factor VIII is so crucial for that final clot formation, even a small defect like that can really throw a wrench in the works, make it much harder for the blood to clot properly.
And that's where those complications come in, right? Because the material mentions something about bleeds into joints and muscles, which sounds super painful.
Yeah, it can be incredibly painful, especially for kids who might not even be able to explain what's going on.
And it's not just a one-time thing either, right?
No.
It mentioned that if these bleeds keep happening, it can lead to this whole other condition called crippling arthropathy.
Right, and that's basically chronic joint damage. Like over time, those repeated bleeds just wear down the joints, and it can really limit mobility.
So it's not just about treating the immediate bleed, it's about preventing those long-term problems too.
Exactly. And it's not just the joints. You mentioned muscles too, right? Those bleeds can cause what are called hematomas, basically, blood collecting under the skin.
Ooh, I've had a hematoma before. Not fun.
Yeah, they're no joke. And with a bleeding disorder, they can be even riskier because they can press on nearby nerves.
And cause nerve palsy, which is...
It's basically a disruption of how the nerve works, so you might see things like muscle weakness, numbness, even paralysis, depending on where it's happening and how bad it is.
Wow, okay, that's a lot. It really highlights how complex this all is.
It really does. And it shows how important it is to diagnose early and manage it proactively to avoid those kinds of complications.
Which is where those tests come in, right?
hmm
The source material mentioned things like measuring APTT, which I guess tells doctors how long it takes for the blood to clot.
Exactly. It's all about getting that accurate diagnosis to figure out the best course of treatment. And thankfully, there's been some huge progress made in managing hemophilia A, especially with recombinant factor VIII.
Oh, right. Instead of relying on donated blood, they can actually make factor VIII in the lab now, right?
That's right. It's been a game changer for a lot of patients because it's a safer and much more readily available option for treatment.
That's incredible. So we've talked a lot about hemophilia A, but the material also mentioned hemophilia B. Are they connected somehow?
You're on the right track. Hemophilia B is also a genetic bleeding disorder where the problem is a missing clotting factor, but in this case, it's factor IX, not factor VIII.
It's the same basic idea, just a different factor that's missing.
You got it. And while the symptoms and inheritance patterns are pretty similar between A and B, they actually need different treatments. So getting that diagnosis right is super important.
So knowing which factor is deficient is key.
Exactly. Now, we've been focusing on inherited disorders, but the material also touches on acquired bleeding disorders.
Acquired. So those are the ones that you're not born with, but you develop later on. What are some examples of those?
Exactly. One that they talk about is liver disease.
Which makes sense because the liver makes a lot of those clotting factors, right?
Right. If the liver is damaged, it can't produce those clotting factors as well, which increases the risk of bleeding problems.
And to make matters worse, liver disease often goes hand in hand with problems absorbing vitamin K. And didn't we say earlier that vitamin K is essential for making those clotting factors? It's like a double whammy.
Exactly. And it shows that sometimes treating bleeding disorders isn't as simple as just giving someone the missing factor. You have to think about the bigger picture.
So treating the liver problem is just as important as managing the bleeding itself.
Exactly. It's all connected.
So liver disease, that's one way you can have clotting problems. But then there's also malabsorption, which the source material mentions too. Does that just mean your body isn't absorbing nutrients from food very well?
Yeah, pretty much. And you know what one of those key nutrients is, right? The one that malabsorption can really impact. Vitamin K.
Vitamin K, there it is again. It's like the MVP of blood clotting.
Right. It just keeps coming up.
Yeah.
And it really emphasizes how important something as simple as a good diet is for preventing these problems.
Totally. I mean, we're talking about these really complex conditions, but sometimes the solutions are surprisingly simple. Speaking of solutions, are there any new treatments on the horizon? Because we've talked about how tricky it can be to manage bleeding disorders, especially when there are underlying issues like liver disease. But the source material mentions some promising stuff like recombinant factor VIII.
Oh, yeah. There's some really cool research being done. Gene therapy, for example. Imagine actually being able to fix those genes that are causing problems like in hemophilia A and B. That could be a game changer.
That would be amazing. Is that something that's close to happening?
It's still early days. I mean, gene therapy is still pretty new, and there's a lot to figure out still, like making sure it's safe and that it really works long term. But the potential is huge. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So much to learn. We've gone from vasoconstriction to vitamin K to gene therapy today.
We've covered a lot of ground, but you really dove into this stuff. You didn't just learn the basics, you really got into the nitty-gritty of what happens when these systems go haywire.
Well, I definitely wouldn't have been able to do it without your help. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
That's what we want. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. If something piqued your interest, dive deeper. There's a ton of information out there about specific bleeding disorders, the latest research, even personal stories from people living with these conditions every day.
It's amazing to have access to all of this information and to know we can advocate for our own health. So, to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you the knowledge to do just that. And remember, knowledge is power. Until next time, keep exploring.